Hi everyone, welcome to part 6 in our series on the Sabbath. In this episode, we are getting into Jesus. We're going to understand what was Jesus doing with the Sabbath, how is he interacting with it, how did he view the Sabbath? And I think you're going to find this to be really interesting because Jesus is very intentional about his engagement with the Sabbath day. So I would like to invite you to come with me to Mark chapter 2, and I'm going to read a few verses out of Mark 2, because in the Gospel of Mark, this issue of the Sabbath is introduced relatively quickly. In fact, it's actually in chapter 1, but this interaction is really astounding. Verse 23, one Sabbath Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along. They began to pick heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Okay, quick pause. What are you doing unlawful on the Sabbath? You go, what's the deal? Jesus' disciples are hungry and they just pick up some grain and they rub it between their hands. Well, one of the big developments during the intertestamental period was that the rabbis, the religious leaders of Israel, took all of their ideas around Sabbath and came up with 39 different categories of work. Now, we see this in some Jewish texts along with the Mishnah, which seems to likely be reflecting what's going on in Jesus' day. But what we know from all of this is that the rabbis had such this desire to live in tune to God and to make the Sabbath what it was supposed to be, because everybody knew that one of the major downfalls that caused the exile was because the people didn't observe Sabbath. That central to their existence in interacting well with one another and with God was observing the Sabbath. And so we talked a little bit about in last week's episode about how detrimental the people had become because they weren't experiencing Sabbath the way God intended. And so in their zeal and their desire to honor God, they came up with all these different categories. And what you're going to begin to see is that Sabbath became unbelievably restrictive. And so one of those categories is that you can't thresh wheat, and so because they're going through a grain field and they're plucking, that's considering harvesting, and then by doing the threshing with their hands, it's like, well, now you're working. And this is what Jesus says. He says, "Have you never read," which by the way is a stinging comment, "what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat, and he also gave some to his companions." Jesus is saying they were hungry, they were in need, they ate, we're good. Same thing with my disciples, they're hungry, they need to eat, we're good. And then Jesus says this, verse 27, "Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." And I love this because what Jesus does in this moment is that he plays his card, if you will, on how we're supposed to engage with Sabbath. When he says the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, what Jesus is saying is that God didn't create the Sabbath so that we could then conform to all of these rules as if the Sabbath is lording itself over us. Jesus goes, Sabbath was made as a gift for us. It is intended to serve us. It is intended to give us life. We don't serve it. It serves us. Now, we'll need to talk about what does that mean and how do we allow it to serve us well. But Jesus is making this bold proclamation that the Sabbath is a gift to us. Abraham Joshua Heschel, in his brilliant book, The Sabbath, he just says this, my favorite quotes from him. "The Sabbath is the most precious present mankind has received from the treasure house of God." Now, I love that quote because it just elevates the significance of Sabbath. I would contend, obviously, that Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, and God's Word, that those are the most precious presents we've received. And then the Sabbath, they're all connected. They're all in relationship on how we interact with them. But I love what he has said with this. It is the most precious present that we've received. Like, it is a gift. And also, let's be reminded, at Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, that, friends, God married Israel at Sinai. That God's wedding gift to his bride on the wedding day was the 10 words, the 10 Commandments. And the one that God spent the most time on was Sabbath. So Sabbath is about life. It is about flourishment. It is a good gift from God. And Jesus identifies that when he says, man wasn't made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. This is a gift from God to us. Now, here's the question I want to ask out of that. What was the gift of the Sabbath ultimately intended to do? If this is a gift, then there's some kind of benefit to it. What was the ultimate thing? We've seen benefits over the last several weeks about this, but what was the overarching umbrella idea, theme that holds everything together for Jesus in reference to the Sabbath? And I would just contend that one of the best places we can see this is in Luke 13. Now, let me just give you a heads up, by the way. Anytime the word Sabbath shows up in the Gospels, slow down and pay attention. Because what we're going to read here in Luke 13 happens in a number of places, in a number of different ways. And the writers are very intentional to tell us this thing happens on a Sabbath. So Luke chapter 13, we've got this story. Says in verse 10, on a Sabbath day, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leaders said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." Can you see how restrictive Sabbath had become? That for someone to heal by using their hands was considered work, and the synagogue leader is condemning Jesus for setting this woman free from 18 years of this infirmity she's had. And then you have this. The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites! Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water?" He's talking about the fact when there was a need, like you respond to needs even on the Sabbath. Verse 16, then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18, and get this, long years. Like Jesus adds that word in there just to remind us this has been not just 18 years, this is 18 long years. She has been through oppression. She has been probably pushed onto the edges of society. This has just impacted how she interacts with family, with her community, with the synagogue community. I mean, there's all of these different layers that we could go into. But here's what I love what Jesus says, is that shouldn't this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her? That the reason why the writers are telling us certain events are happening on Sabbath is because they're helping us to see that for Jesus, there isn't a better day for someone to experience wholeness and restoration and healing than on the Sabbath day. Because in answer to this question, so what was the gift of the Sabbath ultimately intended to do? One word, and it is huge. And if you can get your mind and heart and actions around this, this will compel you more than anything else, I believe, to give Sabbath a go. That for Jesus, it is all about freedom. That again, for many of you who grew up observing Sabbath, and it was in a very restricted context where you can't do this, 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 you can't do this. It was like there's no fun around Sabbath. Jesus looks at the Sabbath and he goes, man, this is a day that is intended to set you free. In fact, Jesus' favorite day to heal was on the Sabbath. Follow all the times that he's healing on the Sabbath, and you realize that this is Jesus' favorite day because the medium is the message. In bringing about wholeness and restoration and healing for people, Jesus is setting them free. And he says in Luke 13, man, this woman has been set free because ultimately, friends, this is what the Sabbath is intended to do. It's intended to set us free. And you go, free from what? Well, let's just be reminded of all the things we've been talking about in the series thus far. Like free to trust God, free from believing that what we have or what we need is completely dependent upon ourselves, that we have to go and work in order to meet our needs. We can be free from that and free to trust that God is sovereign and he's going to take care of the needs that we have and that we're going to be good stewards the rest of the week. Like freedom from believing that it's all dependent upon me. It's freedom from that rhythm of the rat race of go, and our pillow, gets just hit with our head at night and we just crash into it because we go, and we crash, and then we go, and we crash. And every time we crash onto our pillow, we're reminded, I'm getting up and I'm going to do the same thing all over again. It's like, no, to live into the rhythm of creation, to realize that we are a human being and not a human doing, and that we were not designed to go. And we wonder so often why we're sick or exhausted or frustrated or stressed because we have not experienced the freedom of having a proper rhythm with God in creation, right? Free from identity of believing that our worth is connected to our work, that we are what we produce, right? With respect to the smudges that we talked about last week about productivity and consumerism and this, the desires that we have for materialistic things and all of the ways that social media can be a detriment to us and tell us we're not enough and all the different ways that we're reminded that I have to purchase this or buy that in order to be worthwhile, or I have to go on this trip so I have a really great social media account so people will look at my life and go, wow, you've got a great life. You're maximizing your existence, right? To be free from all of this. Because friends, this is vying for our soul. It is sucking the life out of us. And for Jesus, he says, no, Sabbath is a gift to you. And it is a gift that is intended to bring freedom. Another place in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus has this very famous set of words from Matthew 11:28-30, where he says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, I would love to take a whole episode and just unpack this, and we'll do that at a certain point in time. But one of the things I just like to make an observation is that when Jesus says, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light, following Jesus is not easy. We all know that. So what's he talking about here? It has everything to do with this thing called yoke. A yoke, we often think about this as what goes over, oxen, but actually this used in the day of Jesus, a yoke was a rabbi's interpretation or interpretive method. And when Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, when he talks about this in connection to rest, remember the religious leaders of the day had 39 different categories of all the things you couldn't do. And it was out of an intent to be obedient to God, but they lost the plot. And the reason why the gospel writers are telling us all of these stories about Jesus doing things on the Sabbath is that Jesus is constantly confronting them on how they've become way too restrictive on the idea of Sabbath, and that Sabbath had become a suffocating force in people's lives rather than a day that set them free. And so when Jesus says, if you are weary and burdened, right? Just from you living into the rat race, from other people telling you this is what your identity, this is what you're worth in, or maybe they're weary and burdened from following all the rules and regulations of the religious leaders of the day that was just sucking the soul out of them. Jesus goes, I will give you rest. You come to me, learn from me, take my yoke, my interpretation of the Sabbath, about how to live life a way that's in rhythm with what God desires. Listen, you will find rest for your souls. And he says, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light, because Jesus recognizes that following him isn't easy. But when we do follow him, we experience freedom over and over and over and over and over and over again. Now, one of the cool features about this passage, and again, we could do a whole, teaching episode just on these 3 short verses, is that one of the questions you always want to ask when you're ever reading from Jesus is to ask the question, does the phrase that he used show up anywhere else in Scripture? Here's what I mean. This phrase, and you will find rest for your souls, is actually a direct quote from Jeremiah 6:16. We call this a remez. What rabbis would often do is they would quote a key phrase or an entire sentence that was to take you back to a prior context, and then you take that prior context and import it into the present moment. And one of the things that the people would have understood in the midst of Jesus saying this is that this is a direct reference back to Jeremiah 6:16. And in Jeremiah 6:16 we have this. This is what the Lord says. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it. And you will find rest for your souls. So this is in a time where the people are struggling to live in tune with God. Jeremiah is on the scene. He says, this is what the Lord says. Look for this path. Look for this thing that gives you life. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for those ancient paths. Ask where that good way is and walk in it, right? Walk the text. Walk it out. Walk what you're supposed to do, and you will find rest for your souls. And friends, here's the very next line, and I believe Jesus is pulling it in the midst of his conversation. But you said, we will not walk in it. That was their response. When God speaking through Jeremiah says, I'll give you rest for your souls, but just know where that right path is. When Jesus shows up, he says, I am that path. And if you are weary and burdened, I will give you rest. Take my interpretation, take my understanding about rhythms of life and how you're supposed to rest. Listen to me and you will find rest for your souls. But will you be like the people in Jeremiah? Will you be like the southern kingdom when Jeremiah confronted them? Will you just say, nah, I'm just going to continue to do what I want to do because that's how I'm going to choose to live? That, friends, for Jesus, this is all about freedom. And that what Jesus desires us to do is to unleash the freedom. That if we are intentional, if we cease, if we allow Jesus to inform us and allows us to live into this idea of ceasing well, then I believe that in the words of Jesus, we will find rest for our souls. That Jesus will work in us, that we'll experience healing and wholeness and restoration in all aspects of life. And I believe that fundamental to the way Jesus engaged with Sabbath is that it is all about freedom. It is a gift from God, and God wants to know, will you open this gift on a regular basis? Because when you do so, you experience freedom. Well, friends, that's Jesus. That's many of the places where Jesus is engaging with Sabbath. And what I want to do next week is I've just entitled the teaching, Getting Super Practical. And what I want to do is I want to talk about all the ways that I've experienced this in my life, about how Sabbath looks very, very detailed for my family and I, what we're thinking about, what we're engaging in, because I have experienced the greatest freedom in life on Sabbath than at any other day of the week. and I want to talk to you about more of what I have learned. We're going to talk about another passage we haven't looked at yet, but we'll look at it very briefly. But we're going to get super, super practical. But in the meantime, feel free to leave questions underneath this teaching, underneath any of the other ones, because I am going to do one last teaching, not obviously next episode, but the episode after that, where we're going to answer your questions and do whatever is going to be most helpful to you. But there you go. Unleash the freedom, friends. It is available to you, and Sabbath is its core. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and may you walk out the text well in your life.